Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. Today we have here with us a very special guest. It's Dr. Nancy Segal. Just to give you a quick introduction to her, Dr. Nancy Segal is Professor of Developmental Psychology and the Director of the Twin Study Center at California State University at Fullerton. She's been the recipient of many awards and distinctions. She also served as Assistant Director of the Minnesota Center for Twin and Adoption Research in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota from 1985 to 1991. And she's also the author of many books, including Entwined Lives, Indivisible by Two, Someone Else's Twin, Born Together, Reared Apart, and the latest one, which will be one of the focus of today's interview, Accidental Brothers, the story of twins exchanged at birth and the power of nature and nurture. So, Dr. Segal, I hope you're doing well. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I usually don't pose personal questions to my guests because my show is very focused on scientific and philosophical themes, but with you I would like to start by that because you refer in many of your books the fact that you were or you are a twin, right? So I would like to ask you if you could tell us about that aspect of your story, in what ways the fact you have a twin is connected to your personal identity, and also why it had so strong of a grip in your life that it kind of functioned like a primary motivation to study twin psychology.
Yes, well, I'm a fraternal twin. I have a sister. We're the only children in the family. And when I was very small, I was very struck by the fact that despite our similar experiences, we were so different in our appearance, in our interests, our behaviors, our talents, and the way that our parents treated us. We were two very different children. And I've always been interested in what makes people function. And before I even knew what genes were all about, I kind of intuited that there was something very fundamentally different about us. And I began to study psychology when I got to college and high school. I saw that genes had a very important influence on behavior, and everything I read about twin studies fascinated me and made so much sense to me because I knew how different we were. So that really shaped my career. I loved many aspects of psychology, but I loved nature-nurture questions more than anything, probably because I could relate to them so personally. So that is really the basis of why I chose the career that I did.
Mm-hmm, right. And while growing up, and because you had a fraternal twin, would you say that what was more salient in your relationship, the similarities or the differences?
Definitely the differences were more salient in our relationship because we had so few similarities. We had similar values, we had a few similar interests, but basically our temperaments, our personalities were very, very different. And so I think it was the differences more than anything that really put a stamp on the way I thought about things. And as I said, everything I read in the literature after that made so much sense to me. I would see identical twins in my classes at school sometimes, and they would act like they had this special intimacy, this bond, this understanding of one another that I don't believe we really ever had. And perhaps I was jealous of it. I'm sure I was at some level. But nevertheless, the differences between twins fascinated me. And I really urge people when they talk about twins that you must refer to the twin type because the average differences between them are quite extraordinary.
Yeah, sure. And we will get into that in a bit. So just before we get specifically into the themes of your book, could you please tell us, and I already had Dr. Matt McGew on the show from Minnesota, and I posed him the same question, that is, you were one of the main authors in the MISTRA studies at the University of Minnesota. Could you give us a brief account of what you deem to have been the importance of such a scientific endeavor in the history of psychology?
Yes. Well, actually, Ricardo, I've written a book on that called Born Together, Reared Apart, the landmark Minnesota Twin Study, in which I bring together all of the papers and findings and controversies that came from that study. But the MISTRA, or the Minnesota Study of Twins Raised Apart, was a study that looked at the life history differences between separated at birth, identical and fraternal twins, and we tried to discover in what way those differences in rearing might be linked to differences in their behaviors, their interests, their physical development. And by the time we were done, we studied about, I think it was 81 identical reared apart twins and 56 fraternal reared apart twins. And the two main findings from that study, I would say, are that one, genetics has a much more pervasive influence on our behaviors than we ever would have predicted, meaning that more behaviors are affected by genes than we would have thought. A good example of that is religiosity, how much you have religion in your life, the importance of religion. And no one would have predicted that that is genetically influenced, but our reared apart twin studies told us that it was. The second key finding was that sharing an environment with someone in your family does not make you alike. If you are alike sharing an environment with a family member, it's because of your shared genes, not your shared environment. And we know that because if we compare the similarity between identical twins raised apart and identical twins raised together, it's the same. If shared environment made a difference, the identicals together should be more alike, and they're not, across many personality traits and many other kinds of behaviors that we measured.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and one of the findings that I found the most interesting was, and it is still studied today, the fact that for the big five, for example, I think that it is 50% genetic and almost the other 50% due to non-shared environmental things, let's say. So what this really means is that the family doesn't have much of an influence on this type of personality traits in children, right?
Well, I think that we have to be very careful about how we think of the importance of family. You know, I don't want to underestimate the impact that parents can have on children. But I think what parents need to do is to provide a very nurturant and sensitive environment for children. They need to figure out what kinds of environments best support these children. If they can figure that out, that's a very critical role that parents play. I think to suggest from our data that parents don't matter is a real misunderstanding of what we were coming out with. We never implied that at all. And while family environments, I think, don't work in the way we thought they did, I think they work in other ways by needing to provide these nurturant environments.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that from the point you provide your children with all the needs that they have, it's not really possible to change them that much. But if they're in need, then that really has that could have an important effect in the way that specific child develops.
I think what we intend to say is that you really can't change children. You can assist them to get over certain problems. For example, a shy child may be encouraged to be a little more outgoing, or a very rambunctious child can be made to tone down a little bit. But you're basically not going to change a child. And I think, in my experience, Ricardo, the wisest parents are parents of fraternal twins, because they have two children at the same time, and they can see that despite similar experiences, the kids are very different and they require different types of parenting. So I believe that fair parenting is not equal parenting. Fair parenting means sensitivity to each child.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And so now to get a little bit more into your book, you refer in your book to some cases of Colombian twins that, for a reason that I will ask you to talk about, got switched at birth. Their families didn't notice, and they've grown up as pairs of virtual twins. So could you talk a little bit about that? How did you find about these pairs of virtual twins?
Yes.
And what the study of virtual twins tells us about human nature?
Yes. Well, virtual twins is a term that I have used. I didn't come up with it. A very clever mother did, because I've been studying virtual twins for years. And just to define them so everyone's clear on that, they refer to same-age, unrelated children raised together since birth. So what they tell us is how much sharing an environment matters in terms of similar development, right? So they share an environment but nothing else. So how did I find out about the switched Colombian twins? So my colleague on the book, Jessica Montoya, she is from Colombia, and she heard about these twins through her Colombian television station, and she let me know about it. And I was absolutely amazed by this case for a number of reasons, because you had two sets of identical male twins born in Colombia, 150 miles apart. So how did they get switched? Should I tell you the story now? Yes?
Yeah,
All right.
yes, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. So one pair was born in Bogota, lively cultural capital. The other pair born in a tiny little remote farming village 150 miles to the north. Very remote, very isolated. One of those little boys was very sick at birth, and he had to be brought to the better hospital. So they brought him to Bogota. And the idea was he would stay for a week, and then an aunt who lived in Bogota would bring him back. So he was brought by his grandmother. She went back home, and then the aunt was going to visit him every day and take him home. But somewhere during that week, he was switched with a twin in the other pair. No one knows exactly how it happened. But anyway, when she took him home a week later, she brought back the wrong baby. Now, the parents had no idea if the twins were identical or fraternal. One mother had been told they were identical, but these things are never certain. So they grew up as a very special type of virtual twin. And I say that because they believed they were fraternal twins. See, most virtual twins know they're not related, but these virtual twins believed they were fraternal twins, and everybody in their family did, even though they looked tremendously different. And so then, 25 years later, the boys up in the north moved down to Bogota, and they became butchers in a shop in one part of the city. And a woman who worked with one of the Bogota twins went to that butcher shop, and standing behind the counter, she thought her friend was there, the guy that she knew at the company, and she thinks to herself, "What is he? Does he need more money? Is he kind of moonlighting as a butcher on the weekends?" And she couldn't figure out what's going on. But he denied being Jorge. He said his name was William. So she was kind of amazed by it, and she went back and told her friend, and they all laughed about it. And he is a look-alike, big deal. But then about a year later, they began to think about it, and so they began to do some research. The friend did, and they eventually discovered that one thing led to another. She looked at the blood types, the birthdays. They figured out why the one twin came to Bogota. And then about 16 months later, they were all reunited at the age of 26. Pretty amazing story.
Yeah, that's great. And because you already experienced how twins get reunited, would you say that in those situations and in those specific moments, it gets very clear how our affectionate feelings are very much ingrained in our human nature by the way the twins react to one another?
Well, meeting a twin for the first time is a very emotional experience. I know that from working in Minnesota. And usually the identical twins feel a rather instant rapport and understanding because they are so much alike. And most twins were adopted because parents couldn't afford to keep them or something like that. Mother died in childbirth. So to find a biological relative is a really big deal, and a twin especially. In the case of the switched at birth twins, it's a little bit different because they were not adopted. They were wanted babies, and they were switched because of a mistake that some careless nurse did. So suddenly their lives are all revised. I mean, their mother isn't their mother, their father isn't their father, their sibling isn't their sibling. Their whole life is a lie. That happened to two of the boys. So while they felt an immediate interest and understanding and intimacy with the reared apart twin, still it was a very traumatic shock, that the two switched ones went through. I mean, imagine one is living in the city, he has a college degree. He should have been raised in a little tiny town with no college and leaving in 5th grade. And the one raised in the city, in the country, he was desperate for an education. He could never get it, and he sees he should have had it. So that's also, and he never met his parents. They were dead before this happened. So he had some trauma, but basically they get along beautifully, not just within the pairs, but even as a foursome. They look at themselves as a real tight-knit group of brothers, and I really think that's great. They're very lovely guys, all four of them.
Yeah, those are really amazing stories there. Okay, so would you say that, as in your book, you expose how the differences between the virtual twins were so striking that these differences, as we know from other studies done with other people, with twins and even with adoptees and etc., that the differences between them might have accentuated with age as they got more and more independent from their parents and the rest of their family.
Okay, now you're talking about the virtual twins. So,
Yes.
all right, yeah. So what we know from virtual twins that I've studied from ordinary adoptees, as these adoptees get older, the difference between them tend to be stronger, right? Because once you leave the home and you're no longer under the influence of your parents, you're freer to be who you are. You're not restricted. And so we find that genetic influence tends to go up if you follow these unrelated over time. So it's better for me to talk about groups of virtual twins as opposed to just the Colombian twins, which is a very special case.
Sure.
But yeah, I think intuitively people think that we should become more different with time. Virtual twins do, but identical twins don't necessarily. In some ways they become more alike over time, as their different genes get expressed. So it's a very fascinating process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a very strong case for the genetic basis of our personalities, right? Because when we get more and more independent from our parents and the rest of our family, and we get into a situation when we are able to create, let's say, our own environment, then our selves get more fully expressed, let's say.
That's exactly right, Ricardo. And in fact, a very good example of that has to do with religiosity. Now, years ago, they began to study religiosity in twins living together, young twins, and they found no genetic effect. So they said religiosity has no genetic effect. But that's because they were studying small children, identical and fraternal, reared at home when they have to do what their parents tell them. As they got older and left the home, then we find religiosity does have a genetic component. And it worked that way also with sports participation, how much you in sports. Parents say, you must play tennis, you must play basketball. But when they're free to make the decision on their own, the genetic effects come out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another very interesting aspect that I think that is very important for people to understand, mainly parents, is that many times when there are striking similarities between parents and their children, they have a much more genetic basis than people used to think, because when the parents are very similar to their children, then what the parents usually say is that, they are very similar to me because I raised them like this. But
yes.
But sometimes it's really a gene-environment correlation, in this case a passive gene-environment correlation could be acting there, right?
That's right. And what we mean by a passive gene-environment correlation is that parents pass down both genes and environments to children, so you can't disentangle them. The way to disentangle them, of course, is with twin studies and adoption studies. So we find, for example, in intelligence, if you look at a biological parent who gave a child away, and look at the similarity between the child and the biological parent and the child and the adoptive parent, it's much more similar to the biological parent. So, yes, genes do play an important role in similarity. And what's also fascinating, as I think I talk about in the book Accidental Brothers, is that there is some habits that you can see in a grandparent, then you don't see them in the next generation, but they pop up in the third generation, and where there's no contact between people. So that's also very interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so I think that I couldn't have this conversation with you without addressing the issue of nature versus nurture, this dichotomy, right? Because it's a very complex issue, and even scientists now and then get into discussions, and it seems to be very difficult to talk about it in ways that dispel all doubts about it. And B, and I think this is even more important, that the mass media usually does an extremely poor job of presenting and dealing with the issue. They either present it as being all environment or all genetics, right? And
yeah.
It's not really like that it works.
Yeah, so let me comment on two things that you said that are very important points. So the first is that we really don't speak about nature versus nurture. That's really a false dichotomy, and we talk about nature and nurture because they work together. Now, in a single person, you cannot divide up their personality or their height or their weight or whatever into a genetic and environmental component because it's all intertwined. When we give things a number, for example, when we say that personality is 50% genetically influenced, we're talking about a population of people. We're talking about individual differences, variation from person to person. So if I were to give a personality questionnaire to a group of people, there'd be a bunch of different scores. And why do the scores all differ? Partly because of genetic influences and partly because of environmental effects that differ between them. Now, when it comes to the media, I agree that things like this are not clearly explained, and they tend to talk about a gene for personality or a gene for this or a gene for that, when in fact most complex behaviors like intelligence, like personality, like values are determined or influenced by many, many, many genes working together with the environment. There are very few human traits that are governed by a single gene, and those are mostly medical kinds of conditions. Very few behaviors are under the influence of one single gene. So to say a gene for this or a gene for that is really very misleading.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's interesting because some time ago I interviewed Dr. Eric Turkheimer, and I talked with him about gene-environment correlations and interactions. And for example, I would like to ask you particularly about IQ and intelligence, because I asked him about this and it's a very complicated issue. Would you say that the genetic part of IQ, what it determines is kind of an upper ceiling above which people can't go, that is really genetically determined, but if people are raised in poorer or richer environments, they can get closer to that upper ceiling, but I mean it's not infinitely plastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, genes set, I guess, a kind of range where we can go. And certainly, given more opportunities, there are more ways that we can use those opportunities to get higher or to stay lower. I mean, you can put a person who has great potential in a very rich environment. If they have no motivation, they may not excel at all. So it really just depends. Now, the Colombian twins are a nice example of this because the guys in the country did not go beyond the 5th grade. And so their intelligence scores were lower than the city boys, and they were quite similar. Whereas the city boys were a lot higher, and they were a little bit less alike. So that's because they had opportunities to do things. So, we think about people creating their own environments, from the opportunities available to them. And that's why twins raised apart are usually quite similar in intelligence despite the different environments. But if you take somebody raised in a very impoverished environment where there's not a lot of opportunity, that's going to depress measured intelligence. And one of my colleagues did a study where he looked at twins from a very poor area, and he found that the genetic effect was almost zero in that particular population. So extreme environments can have an effect. The reared apart twin studies that I've worked with in Minnesota look at twins in sort of the normal, customary, average environments, right? Nothing that is very extreme.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that what Joseph Henrich, and I can't recall the name of the other author, called the weird effect also occurs in studies done with twins?
I'm sorry, which effect are you talking? I didn't hear.
The weird effect, the effect of the studies being done mostly on people from Western, developed, rich, industrialized countries.
Yeah, well, I think that you can't generalize beyond the population in which that you study in. I think certainly measurement is an issue. I know the Colombian twins, the boys in the city were used to paper and pencil tests, the ones in the country were not. So yeah, you can't generalize, I think, beyond the populations in which you're looking at. But I would be surprised if genetics did not play a big role in the intelligence of all groups. I mean, we're all human beings, and I think that things work pretty much the same way. I mean, I know that intelligence tests have been given to people in non-Western countries, and genetic effects have shown up as long as they're within normal ranges of environments.
Mhm.
I think that what people need to understand is that, I mean, people often have no trouble understanding or accepting that genes influence physical development, like height or weight or hair color or eye color. But when it comes to intelligence, it gets very tricky. People don't like that. They like to think they were infinitely malleable. And certainly everybody can improve their abilities if they work hard enough. But we can't all be the same. You know, we just can't all be the same. And that's a good thing from the point of view of human evolution. If we were all one big identical twin, we'd probably die out pretty soon.
Yes, that's true. That's definitely true. Okay, and another question. What would you say is the role that chance plays in people's lives? Would you say that perhaps on the one hand, it has a big role in how people develop, and on the other hand, it also reinforces the idea of innateness because it renders even clearer the observation that people can lead miserable lives if they aren't really able to concretize, let's say, their natural proclivities or their potential?
I think chance plays a role, and I think it plays more of a role in some lives than others. Now, let's give an example of a woman who I know who had a great talent for exercise, professional exercise. And when the exercise class was closed to her, she took a class in another kind of movement and just did beautifully in it, probably better than she would have done the other. So there's a chance event. But is that really chance? She was in this school where classes were available. So within the range of environments, that was not chance. But the chance event was a certain class being closed. See, so I think the chance plays a role, and maybe a bigger role than we think, maybe a bigger role than in some lives than others. Certainly when we have twins switched at birth, that's a chance event that sends one person to one location and keeps one in another location. And that can have very profound consequences. If you're in an accident of some kind, you're accidentally exposed to a disease, that can have very debilitating effects. And then recovery may be genetically influenced in part based on your health, based on your motivation. So I think chance plays a role. It's just hard to know exactly how and to what degree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and with the cases of twins you studied, and because I'm very much interested also in evolutionary psychology, would you say that it also sheds some light on how, for example, apparent uncertainty expresses itself when dealing with, for example, virtual twins? That is, that the father has some sense that one of the children is farther apart from him genetically than the other child, and that it has some effect on how that particular parent or father treats them.
Yeah, so paternity uncertainty has to do with the fact that fathers can never be certain that the child delivered by their partner is truly theirs because ovulation is hidden, it's internal, females are always receptive sexually, so fathers take a chance in that sense. Now, what's very interesting is, in the case of the Colombian twins, one twin was theirs and one twin was not theirs, and I'm sure that if you asked the father, he would say he loves them both the same. But according to one of the twins, the real child was definitely the father's favorite, no question about it. So it may be that you've got to understand these things in a more subtle, indirect fashion. I think that, there have been other cases of switched-at-birth twins, and what's very fascinating too, there are cases of what are called superfecundated twins. And what are these? Superfecundated twins are when a woman releases two eggs at the same time, and then she has sexual relationships with different men within the 4-day window of opportunity for fertilization. So the twins share their mother's genes, but not their father's, so they're genetically half siblings. See? So they're related to the mother, but only one is related to the father. And so it could be that this is a wonderful test case for how the father would relate to the two children. We don't have enough of this yet, but that could be quite fascinating.
Yes. And another kind of studies that you refer to in several of your books, of course, is when you get the opportunity to study triplets. And for example, two of them grow up together and the other one gets reared apart from them. So, in what ways do studies with triplets inform us about human nature that studies with other twins don't inform us as good, let's say?
Well, there have not been as many studies of triplets because there's fewer of them. But there have been studies. We had one set in Minnesota of identical triplets where two were raised together and one was raised apart. And the raised apart ones were fairly similar. We did not get much data on the one raised with the other one. But I had studied twins which is very fascinating, triplets rather, where two are identical and one is fraternal. And the identicals seem to have a much closer relationship with each other than they do with the fraternal co-triplet, which I think is very interesting because they're all raised together. But now that the triplets are surviving more, and because the rate of them has gone up because of in vitro fertilization, I think triplets could be a nice addition to what twins and adoptees can tell us.
Exactly. Okay, and what is your view on epigenetics? And I want to ask you this because there are people with different takes on it. There are people who say that they find it a bit exaggerated in terms of its promises to explain human behavior, because they say that it sometimes tries to put too much emphasis on the environmental side of things. But then again, it seems that it's pretty clear that environmental influences the way genes get expressed. So what do you have to say about epigenetics and probably the future role that it can have?
Well, I think epigenetics is a very important discipline that we need to pay attention to. I think, with any discipline, you want to take kind of a balanced view with anything. I think that where epigenetics can make the biggest impact for twins, where we can get more information for the general public, is with disease. Because we know that many diseases which have a genetic basis, like diabetes, like multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, autism, can differ in identical twins. And why is that? Because it has to be something in the environment acting on the genetic predisposition in a different way. So if we can figure out what that is, we might be able to stall the disease in the non-twin population. So I think that's where twins have a very important place to play. What I like about epigenetics is that in many cases we've talked about how the environment affects gene expression, but here if we can actually see which genes are expressed or unexpressed, that gives us a real handle, on what is actually going on, sort of beneath the skin. Very fascinating, in the Colombian twins, this is the first analysis ever of epigenetics in reared apart twins. That was the first one. And it's all published in the book, and we have a paper in a journal. And we found that as they aligned, one identical pair aligned very beautifully in their epigenetic profile. The other pair did not. And it could be something prenatal, we just don't know. But the one twin who was raised apart from his older sister, so they were full siblings but raised apart, they aligned very nicely. So it was just one of those cases that did not, and that's very, very interesting. The prenatal environment for identical twins is not the same as people think. There's different positioning in the womb, and there can be different hormonal exposures and different nutrition, and all these could potentially affect the epigenome.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's very important for people to get that clear. That is, when we talk about the environment, people that are not really scientifically minded would perhaps think immediately that the environment is just everything that particular person is exposed to once they get out of the womb, that is after birth. But we also have the prenatal environment, and it's also very important and can play a big role in how people develop and their different epigenetic profiles, let's say, right?
Yes, very important. The prenatal environment is very, very important. And the early environment, too. Babies who are breastfed for longer periods of time have less susceptibility to being overweight or diabetes. So these are all well-known facts that I think need to be communicated to future generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Okay, and this is kind of a philosophical question, but can't you also conclude from these studies with twins in general that in order for society to function properly, and I want to ask you this because of the close contact you had, for example, with the twins in Colombia, that in order for society to function properly, we need people of different temperaments and personalities?
Well, I think that human diversity is very important, and that there are different niches to play or to be in that will contribute to human functioning and human progress and human growth. So yes, we do need diversity in talents and personalities. I think that's all very, very important. Otherwise, we would be the same, and that would never work. So yeah, I think
yes,
that's...
and because we also need to fulfill different roles in society, and we're not good at all of them, let's say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody deserves an education. Everybody should have equal opportunities. But there are some people who don't want to go on in school. I service many students here at my university, and I have some students who want to get a bachelor's and then they never want to go to school again. And then I have students who want a master's and they don't want to go on. And then I have students who want to go for a PhD and they want to be professors. And, so they're lucky they have the choices. But if I were to force a student to go on for a PhD who didn't want it, that's no good. But this student may serve another function that's very, very important. So I applaud people's different interests and talents and all of that. I think it's very important. Women who don't want to work or men who don't want to work, they may want to do things at home. I mean, that's fine. They're not hurting anybody. They're contributing in some way. I have no problem with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And isn't it interesting how some things can backfire? So, for example, for people that put too much emphasis on the environmental side of things, and whenever they hear someone talking about genetic influences on psychology and behavior, and particularly when it's applied in more contentious topics like, for example, gender differences, they immediately step back and even name call people who talk about those particular aspects. But if our psychology and our behavior were to be completely the result of the environment we were exposed to, then our variability would be probably much less. Right?
Could be. I think that the trouble is that people tend to attach values to things. So, for example, we know in gender differences, men on average do better in spatial skills, women on average do better in verbal skills. And so if you start to say which is better or more important, that's silly. It's a silly argument. They're important, both of them, depending on the situation. So if I were lost in a cave, maybe on average I'd like to have a male with me, and maybe on average if I'm in a law case and someone has to argue in a clever way, I might want a female with me. But to give one, it's the value judgments that get us in trouble. Now, there was a very famous evolutionary biologist named Dobzhansky. Maybe you've heard of him, Dobzhansky. And Dobzhansky put it beautifully when he said that differences are not deficits. See, they're just differences. And that's all we can speak about. We can't say which is better or which isn't. And I think that's such an important point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and even the fact that, for example, when people have an ideological view of things and they want, for instance, that in all walks of life, for example, in all academic disciplines and in all professional occupations, they want men and women to have a perfect distribution of 50-50. I mean, in some areas, to make that possible, they would have to force women, for example, to go into those areas, and they could be making their lives miserable because women don't really like to have those sorts of occupations or to study those sorts of things.
And it could work that way with men too. To force somebody in just to acquire equal numbers, I think, is a mistake. And I think that people tend to think that if something is environmentally acquired, it's very easy to change it. But let's take let's take the example that I give my students of that we all learn to drive our cars and go on green and stop on red, and it becomes a very automatic process. Now, tomorrow, if I were to say we're going to go on red and stop on green, wouldn't be so easy to change. There'd be a lot of car accidents out there. So environmental influence is not so easy to change some of the time.
Yeah, exactly.
And you think about biological influences, some may be easier to change than others. I mean, if you're a redhead, you can maybe dye your hair to blonde. I mean, just a silly example like that. But, you know, if you have a certain kind of condition, maybe a drug will modify that condition. So even genetically influenced traits can be modified to some degree, depending.
Yes, and what do you say about the idea that some people espouse of nurture via nature? That is, that the way people are reared, or even the culture we create, all of that has a biological basis, and so there's not really never something that is purely cultural or purely environmental.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far to say something is not purely this or purely that, but I do love the concept of nurture via nature and nature via nurture. The idea that, you know, we select environments based on our genetic propensities, and that people respond to us in ways that are consistent with our behavior. So I really love those terms. I love them both ways that they go.
Great. Okay, so we already talked a little bit about this, but I would like to get more into it. That is, how could we translate all of this knowledge coming from twin studies, adoptive studies, and behavioral genetics in general into good parenting practices? We already touched a little bit on it, but would you like to expand on it?
Well, I think there are many ways of getting those findings out. I think that more psychologists, more professionals, more scientists need to be active in the public, not just in academics. Need to write books. I've written 6 books already, so people can look at my books. But also public lectures, all these kinds of things, leaflets, talking to clubs, parents of twins organizations, or regular parents organizations. I think that there are too many academics who just publish in academic journals and don't get out there into the public. Now, I'm of the opinion that I love being out in the world of twins and parents of twins. It gives me ideas. It's very refreshing. I feel that my findings can really be used by people. And one interesting way that my findings have been used, which I never had thought of before, is through attorneys, because attorneys encounter cases involving wrongful death, injury, custody, cheating accusations, believe it or not. And a lot of my findings have been useful in the courtroom. And so I think that people like me need to be more active out there. Now, I know that there are some people, academics, colleagues, who wouldn't even come on your show because they're always afraid of being misquoted and this sort of thing. I take a chance. I think that you take a chance. I've been misquoted sometimes, but most of the time, it's been a great experience. And so I think it's the responsibility of people to get the findings out there.
Yeah, but particularly about good parenting practices, would you say that what we could try to teach people, parents in this case, is that they should try to treat each children as an individual instead of trying to follow a general set of rigid guidelines to try to apply forcefully to all children?
Yes, of course. I think the trick, though, is just getting that information to the parents. And so what I'm trying to think of is how we can reach parents. And I think that best way is through television programs or lectures to parenting groups. One thing that's always concerned me, for example, is that there's been this big press in the U.S. to sing to your children, read to them all the time. And great, I agree with all that. But I think that parents sometimes have false expectations that have been created by the media, that if you simply read and sing to your child, the child's going to have a brilliant IQ. Some kids that will help them, some kids may have no effect, some kids may be too much information, they won't like it. So you have to kind of see and gauge how your child reacts to these things. I think that to have parental expectations sometimes can be a mistake, because you may do what the media tells you and you're not getting the results. So maybe a certain child learns another way, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and just the other day I talked with Dr. Louis Goldberg, who is one of the creators of the Big Five. Do you think that perhaps the knowledge we can obtain from behavioral genetics when applied to personality traits, for example, if parents were to have access to quantification, let's say, of their children personality traits, that by itself could give them valuable information about how to deal with them?
It might, but you would want to give a parent more than just a score on a test. You'd want to see the child in different sorts of contexts, different situations. A child may act a little differently at home than he does in school, so you'd want to get a big picture of what that child does. Whenever children are referred for cognitive ability testing, it's not just one test, but it's many, many tests taken together. So it might help parents to some degree, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and isn't it also true, or perhaps it's true, that because we have this effect that we already talked about, the passive gene-environment correlation, that perhaps many times parents wouldn't even need to put so much effort into performing certain kinds of activities to stimulate their children, because they by themselves would have those innate proclivities, let's say.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at, and I think there's some rationale to that, but you just want to make sure that you give the child the opportunity to do these kinds of things. Yeah, the children, if you give them certain things and they have the abilities, they'll probably act on it. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, Dr. Segal, just before we finish this, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can follow your work on the internet? And I don't know if you're active on any social media or not. And also, I don't know if you're working on a new book or not, and if you'd like to give us some small teaser of it.
Yeah. Well, the best place people can find out about me is at my website, and that's drnancysegaltwins.org, and it's Dr. Nancy Segal, it's Segal, twins.org. That's the best thing. I am on Twitter. I don't use it as much as I should, but I'm on Twitter. Maybe I'll start using it more as a result of the show. And on my homepage, there are a number of studies that I have that people can take part in. Online studies of twin bereavement, my virtual twin study, they can sign up. I have studies on Chinese twins adopted apart from birth and adopted together, and parents who are twins, and all kinds of interesting people who look alike and aren't related, all kinds of interesting things. And I am considering another book, but because the proposal is being circulated now, I won't say much about it.
Okay, that's fair enough. So
Yeah.
I will leave all of that in the description box below for people who will be watching this, and also the links to your books, which I really loved. I read almost all of it, and I will read the rest of them for sure. They're really very well written, and I think they are very clear even to lay people. So I think you're doing a great job in trying to get this sort of science out there for the general public. And so, Dr. Segal, I would like again to thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today. It was really a pleasant conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. A pleasure for me, too.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett and Per Helge Larsen. Thank you for all.